Episode 2. The Proclamation to the Officers. The Call of the Mountains and Rivers **** after days of being torn between family vengeance and duty to the nation, Trần Quốc Tuấn finally chose the path that history had long expected of him. But even as the people of Đại Việt began to unite beneath the banner of the Trần dynasty, a massive shadow was slowly descending upon the south. It was no longer just a rumor carried by merchants traveling across the border. It was a terrifying reality approaching day by day with the thunder of horses and the flames of the Yuan-Mongol Empire. In the year 1284, the winter skies over Đại Việt felt colder than ever before. Bitter winds swept along the Red River, carrying grim news from the north. After conquering the Song dynasty, Kublai Khan had turned his ambitious gaze toward the south. Đại Việt was no longer simply a small kingdom on the edge of the empire. It had become an obstacle that needed to be crushed in order to clear the path for the conquest of all Southeast Asia. Inside the royal court of Thăng Long, the officials stood in silence as the Yuan envoy entered with an arrogant expression. Clad in northern battle robes, his cold voice echoed throughout the court as he demanded that Đại Việt allow the Yuan army to borrow passage in order to attack Kampa. But everyone understood that it was only an excuse. Once the Mongol horses crossed the border, there would be no road left leading to peace. The atmosphere in the royal court grew as heavy as the sky before a violent storm. Some nobles began to waver. They had heard stories of cities flattened by the Mongols, of mighty armies across Europe and China being mercilessly destroyed. Some whispered that Đại Việt was too small to resist such a storm. Others proposed surrender in order to preserve the royal bloodline. Their words were not loud, but they were enough to plant fear deep within the hearts of men. Outside the walls of Thăng Long, that same fear slowly spread into the military camps. Young soldiers sat around campfires during the freezing nights, silently looking at one another without daring to speak their thoughts aloud. They knew this enemy was unlike any army they had faced before. The Mongols were feared for their cruelty and terrifying speed. Lands that were once prosperous had turned into ashes beneath their horses' hooves. Amid that atmosphere, Trần Quốc Tuấn understood that the greatest danger was not yet the spears and swords of the Yuan army. The most terrifying threat was the collapse of morale before the battle had even begun. That night, inside the Vạn Kiếp camp, firelight flickered across military maps spread over a wooden table. Outside, the harsh winter wind roared through the dark forest. Trần Quốc Tuấn sat in silence for a long time before finally lifting his brush. His eyes carried the heavy burden of an entire nation's fate. He understood that an army could survive a few days without supplies and still continue fighting. But an army that lost its spirit would already be defeated before even drawing its swords. And then, line by line, words began appearing upon the white silk. It was not merely a military proclamation. It was the call of the mountains and rivers themselves. Every sentence in the Hich Tuong Si, the proclamation to the officers, was written with the pain of a man who could already see the future awaiting his people if Đại Việt were to fall. Trần Quốc Tuấn did not begin with threats or commands. Instead, he opened with stories of loyal and righteous men from ancient Chinese history. He spoke of Khai Tin, who sacrificed himself for his king. He mentioned Dun Huang, who swallowed burning charcoal in order to avenge his lord. These stories were not merely praises of loyalty. They were sparks meant to ignite pride and honor within every warrior of Đại Việt. Then the tone of the writing began to change. It became fierce like thunder splitting the winter sky. Trần Quốc Tuấn exposed the arrogance and brutality of the Yuan invaders. He called them vultures and savage beasts that dared insult the court of Đại Việt. Every word carried the burning rage of a nation that refused to bow its head. But what moved the soldiers most deeply was not that fury. It was the sorrow within the heart of their commander himself. At mealtimes, I forget to eat. In the middle of the night, I pound my pillow. My heart aches as if cut by knives, and tears soak my face. Those words spread across the camps like lightning tearing through the darkness. Every soldier understood that before them stood not only a brilliant general, but also a man whose soul truly suffered for the fate of his homeland. In the days that followed, the Hich Tuong Si was read aloud everywhere. From river docks and military camps to fortresses and distant fields, Its heroic words echoed alongside the thunder of war drums throughout Đại Việt. Many soldiers stood frozen as they listened to every sentence. Some clenched their swords so tightly that blood ran from their hands. Others lowered their heads and wept silently. And many young men, for the very first time, realized that this war was not merely about protecting the royal court. It was about protecting their own families and homeland. Not long afterward, the Bình Than Conference was convened. Upon the great river covered in cold mist, the warships of the Tran princes stretched across the water like a steel wall. Generals and nobles gathered together to discuss how to defend the nation. Tension hung heavily over the river. But this time, the eyes of the people had changed. Trần Quốc Tuấn proclamation had not only transformed the spirit of the army, it had transformed the will of Đại Việt itself. The voices calling for surrender slowly disappeared. In their place rose a determination to fight until the very end. The generals began preparing for the greatest war in the nation's history. Food supplies were secretly transported. Wooden stakes were driven deep beneath the rivers. Troops trained day and night in the freezing rain. Across the country, the spirit of resistance burned like fire in the heart of winter. Then a powerful image began appearing throughout the military camps. One by one, soldiers used knives to carve 2 words onto their own arms. SAT that. Kill the Mongols. Beneath the flickering flames of winter nights in Đại Việt, thousands of raised arms bearing those words became a blood oath sworn to the nation itself. The most powerful empire in the world was marching toward the south. But this time, Đại Việt was ready.